You are not waiting for the right moment. You are waiting for someone to tell you that you are allowed. That is a different thing entirely. The right moment can arrive on its own. Permission rarely does. And the longer you wait for it, the more natural the waiting begins to feel. It settles into the body. It takes on the texture of patience, of wisdom, of being the kind of person who does not rush. But it is not patience. It is a learned restraint, a protection built so gradually and reinforced so consistently that it stopped looking like a choice a long time ago. It became character, personality, who you are. You are capable. That part has never been the question. The question, the one that sits quietly beneath everything you prepare and absorb and defer, is whether you believe you are allowed to say so, to move without being summoned first, to claim what you have already earned without waiting for someone else to hand it to you. This episode is about that belief, where it came from, what it is protecting, and what it is costing you. She had wanted the role for 2 years. She knew the work better than most people in the department. She had covered for her manager during 2 extended absences. She had trained the newer staff, resolved the conflicts no one else wanted to touch, and quietly absorbed responsibilities that had never been formally assigned to her. And yet, when the position was posted internally, she did not apply. She told herself she was waiting to see if they would approach her, that if her work was good enough, someone would notice. That applying directly would seem eager, maybe even presumptuous. She was not the kind of person who pushed herself forward. So she waited. The role went to someone she had trained. She was not angry exactly. She was something harder to name, a dull, familiar heaviness. The sense of watching something move past her that had been, in some way, already hers. She went home that evening and sat with the feeling for a long time without quite looking at it directly. In the weeks that followed, she worked just as carefully as before. She did not complain. She did not pull back. She simply continued. And beneath that continuity, something she could not easily articulate, the sense that she had done everything correctly and still arrived at the wrong place. She had been waiting for someone to tell her she deserved it. No one had. And the question that kept returning quietly in the background of ordinary days was whether they ever would. Or whether, more unsettling still, she had always known they would not, whether the waiting had never really been about timing at all. Step outside the story for a moment. There is an assumption operating beneath everything she did. It was not dramatic or obvious. It did not announce itself. It simply shaped the terrain, the way a slope shapes a path without anyone deciding to build the path that way. The assumption was this: visible desire is dangerous. Not in a direct way, not as a conscious belief she could point to and examine, but embedded in her behavior was the idea that wanting something openly and acting on that want without being invited first carries a particular kind of exposure, a risk of being seen as too much, too ambitious, too certain of her own worth before someone else has confirmed it. And beneath that was something even quieter, something that did not show itself clearly until you held still long enough to feel it. The belief that worth must be recognized before it is claimed, that moving forward without that prior recognition is somehow presumptuous, a violation of the natural order of things. There is a logic to this belief. It is not irrational. In many environments, people who claim their worth before others have assigned it are penalized. They are called arrogant or pushy or naive. The belief formed as a response to something real. It has evidence behind it. But notice what the belief requires in practice. It requires you to make yourself legible to others before you can act, to pass through their assessment before you are permitted to move, which means the source of permission is always external, always somewhere out there in the judgment of someone else, in the slow accumulation of their approval. This is not the same as low self-esteem. She knew she was capable. She had the evidence of that capability in plain sight, in every task she had absorbed, in every conflict she had resolved, in every person she had trained who was now moving ahead of her. But knowing you are capable is different from believing you are allowed to say so. To act on it directly, without the mediating step of being seen and invited first. That distinction between competence and permission is where the real story lives, and it is quiet enough and familiar enough that most people who carry it never quite see it as a distinction at all. It simply feels like the way things work. This assumption does not form in isolation. It is trained into people carefully over time through repetition and consequence, usually without anyone intending harm. The people who pass it on are often carrying it themselves. It moves between generations not as a lesson explicitly taught, but as a climate that shapes what feels safe. In families where being direct about your own desires was considered selfish, children learn to soften their wanting, to approach it sideways, to frame every request as something other than what it actually is, a need, a preference, a desire that belongs entirely to them. They learn that desire expressed openly creates friction, and that smoothing the friction is worth the cost of the indirectness. In schools where the praised quality is not curiosity or initiative but compliance, students learn that the path to recognition runs through meeting expectations rather than exceeding them in ways that were not asked for. Patience in those environments is rewarded. Stillness is rewarded. The student who waits to be called on is safer than the one who reaches forward. In workplaces where ambition in certain people is quietly penalized, where it reads as threatening rather than promising, professionals learn to translate their ambition into service. They make themselves indispensable by giving more, not by asking for more. They accumulate value and wait for someone to notice, because noticing is the socially acceptable mechanism for advancement. Claiming is not. The reinforcement is subtle. It rarely comes as an explicit instruction. It comes as a look, a slight shift in temperature, a difference in how people respond when you hold back versus when you take up space. It comes in the specific quality of warmth that follows self-effacement, in the comfort people around you feel when you do not make claims. And there is a particular social reward built into waiting that is easy to mistake for something genuine. People who do not push forward are considered safe, agreeable, easy to be around. The person who quietly absorbs more than their share and asks for nothing in return tends to earn a specific kind of affection, not the admiration of equals, but the comfort of people who benefit from their patience. This becomes its own feedback loop. The waiting is rewarded with warmth. The warmth confirms the behavior. And over years, a strategy that began as adaptation hardens into identity. The person stops thinking of it as waiting. They begin thinking of it as who they are. Humble, steady, patient, the kind of person who does not need to push, who trusts the process, who lets the work speak for itself. These are not bad qualities. In isolation, each of them has real value, but in this configuration, they are also a structure, a way of organizing a life so that a particular kind of risk never has to be taken. And the idea that the stillness is not peace but containment, that something underneath it has been kept very carefully in place, does not fit easily into the story the person has built about themselves. It is easier, and in many ways more comfortable, to believe that you simply do not have the kind of personality that pushes forward, that you are built for patience, that the waiting is a reflection of who you are rather than something you learn to do in order to remain acceptable. That belief is the outer wall of the assumption, and it holds. Carl Jung spent much of his work paying careful attention to what people do not show. Not what they hide deliberately in the conscious sense of choosing concealment, but what they cannot easily see in themselves, what has become invisible to them through the process of becoming who they are. He called this the shadow, not darkness in the moral sense, not wickedness or failure, but the accumulated weight of everything a person has set aside in order to be acceptable, to be safe, to belong in the world they were placed in. The shadow forms early and it forms quietly. A child discovers through repeated experience which parts of themselves draw warmth and which draw withdrawal, which expressions of need, desire, anger, ambition, or hunger bring closeness and which create distance. Gradually, without being told explicitly, the parts that do not produce the right response are moved inward, not destroyed, not forgotten, just held at a distance from expression, quieted. What emerges outward is what Jung called the persona, the face shaped for the world. It is not false exactly. The persona draws from real qualities, but it is selective. It is the self arranged for presentation, calibrated over years of feedback to produce the responses that feel safest. Capable, composed, agreeable, easy to admire from a comfortable distance, not threatening, not excessive. The persona is a partial self. It emphasizes what has been rewarded and mutes what has not. And because it has been refined over so many years, because it has been confirmed by so much external response, it comes to feel like the whole self. The person inside the persona stops experiencing it as a mask. It simply becomes how they are. But the tension between what is shown and what is held back does not disappear. It persists beneath the surface. It expresses itself in indirect ways that are easy to misread as tiredness, as dissatisfaction without a clear object, as the particular dull heaviness of watching others take what you did not reach for. In the specific exhaustion of having consistently given more than you allowed yourself to receive. Jung observed something essential about this dynamic. The qualities a person places in the shadow do not simply go dormant. They gather there and they press back against the surface, not as coherent demands but as a low, persistent pressure. They show up in recurring patterns, in the shape of the losses that keep repeating, in the situations that produce the same feeling every time, the feeling that is harder to name than sadness, but that sits in the same part of the body. In her case, the shadow held something precise. Not reckless ambition, not grandiosity, not a desire for recognition beyond what was reasonable. Something much simpler and more legitimate than that. The desire to be seen by her own hand, to step forward without first being summoned, to let what she had actually built speak in the form of a direct claim that she had built it. That desire had been present the entire time she was preparing, the entire time she was covering and training and absorbing. It had not diminished through waiting. It had only grown quieter, more internal, more disconnected from any channel through which it might actually move. It had nowhere to go because she had not given it anywhere to go. And in the absence of an outlet, it had become the very thing pressing against the inside of her stillness. The heaviness that did not quite make sense when she tried to explain it to herself. the distance between what she knew she could do and what she had actually allowed herself to claim. Seen through this lens, the story changes shape. Not dramatically, not in the way that makes everything suddenly clear and resolved, but the shape of it shifts enough to show something that was not visible before. What looked like patience was also avoidance. What looked like humility was also suppression, not because patience and humility were not real, they were. She had genuine qualities of steadiness and care that were not performances, but those qualities had been recruited into the service of something else. They had been arranged around the avoidance in a way that made the avoidance look like virtue. The waiting was not neutral. It was a structure with a specific function. A way of ensuring that the part of her that wanted openly, that could step forward without apology, would never actually have to risk the thing it most feared, because it would never extend itself far enough to be rejected. This is the architecture of the protection. If you never apply, you are never turned down. If you never claim, no one can tell you the claim was wrong. If you wait for invitation, then the failure to arrive is not your failure, it is simply the world's oversight. And that is easier to carry than the alternative, that you reached and the world said no. So the desire is preserved by being kept inside, never tested, never contaminated by outcome. The shadow in this sense does something that looks like preservation. It holds what has been placed inside it exactly as it was. The ambition she set aside at 28 is still there at 38, unchanged, still carrying the same warmth and the same certainty it had when she first felt it. The shadow does not erode what it holds. But preservation is not the same as expression. And the cost of keeping something perfectly intact inside is that it has no effect on the actual world. It remains potential without becoming action, energy without direction, weight without movement. The cost accumulates slowly. It shows up as that specific kind of sadness that is hard to name because it is not attached to a particular loss. It is the weight of a life running consistently below its own level, not a collapsed life, not a failed life, an organized, functional, even admired life that is somehow always slightly less than what the person inside it knows it could be. She did not need someone to finally notice her. That frame, waiting for the right person to see clearly enough, was part of the same structure. It kept the locus of movement outside herself, in someone else's eventual clarity. What the situation required was something smaller and harder than that. Just honesty about what she had been keeping still, not a declaration, not a reinvention. Simply an acknowledgement, private and clear, that the waiting was a choice, that it had always been a choice. And that the choice was costing something real. There is no clean resolution at the end of this recognition. Seeing the pattern does not dissolve it. The shadow does not empty itself because it has been named. The persona that took years to build and decades to reinforce does not step aside because the architecture beneath it has been identified. The conditioning was real, and the logic it followed made genuine sense in the environments where it formed. Understanding that logic does not immediately release a person from operating inside it. What changes is not the behavior, not right away. What changes is the clarity with which the behavior is seen. The waiting becomes visible as waiting. It is no longer hidden inside the language of patience or virtue or being the kind of person who does not push. It can be seen plainly without that protective framing. A choice made repeatedly, quietly, in the direction of safety rather than expression. And with that clarity comes a different kind of weight than the one that was there before. Before, the weight was diffuse. It was the heaviness of dissatisfaction without a clear object, the tiredness that came from carrying something that had no name. That kind of weight is actually harder to carry in some ways because it has no edges. You cannot set it down because you cannot quite locate it. It simply saturates everything. The weight that comes with clarity is more specific. It is the weight of knowing, of seeing the pattern accurately and understanding what it has cost and not being able to return to the version of yourself that did not see it. That is a different kind of difficulty, not lighter, but more defined. Some people arriving at this recognition expect what follows to feel like relief, and there is a quality of relief in it, the relief of things finally making sense. But it sits alongside something harder, the knowledge that the years inside the pattern were years, that the losses were real, that the role did go to someone else, and that no amount of clarity about why it happened returns what was given away. This is not cause for despair, but it is not cause for comfort either. It simply is. Many people stay in this place for a long time. They carry the recognition clearly. They can describe exactly what the pattern is and where it came from and what it has cost them. And they still find it difficult, genuinely, honestly difficult, to move differently. The pull of the old structure is strong. The persona knows how to produce safety, and the body remembers that safety, and the memory is powerful enough to override the clarity on a given afternoon when the moment comes to act. That is not failure. That is the actual texture of this kind of change. It does not happen cleanly in a single moment of resolution. It happens unevenly, in small increments, in moments where the recognition is present and the old pull is also present, and the person has to choose between them with full awareness that both are real. The persona does not disappear, but it can be seen clearly enough to be distinguished from the self underneath it. There is a version of this recognition that becomes its own kind of waiting, where seeing the pattern becomes the thing a person does instead of changing it, where awareness becomes another form of stillness. That is worth noting. Clarity is not the same as movement. It is only the beginning of the possibility of movement. But it is a beginning. And that distinction between the face that was built for the world and the person who built it is not a small thing to hold. It is, in fact, where everything else starts. Waiting for permission is not patience. It is a way of ensuring the most tender parts of yourself never have to meet the world unprotected. Most of us have something we have kept very still. A desire we did not act on because acting would require claiming it. A version of ourselves we have held back because moving forward felt like overstepping. A quiet ambition that learned early to translate itself into preparation instead of motion. That stillness is not nothing. It took real effort to maintain. It served something genuine. But there is a difference between waiting, because the moment is not right, and waiting, because the self is not yet allowed. Somewhere in that difference is the question worth sitting with. Not loudly, not urgently. Just honestly, quietly. The way a private conversation with yourself tends to go when you finally stop moving long enough to hear it.